Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with composers, chord guys versus line guys. Well, now we are at the heart of the matter, aren't we? Because what determines whether performers are chord guys versus line guys is the music that they're playing. It's the kind of music that they play and what the composers demand of them and the composers that they have the most powerful affinity for playing. And so, yes, it's at the level of the composer that the chord guy versus line guy distinction is going to be most telling. And I have 10 of each. But first, we need to have a tiny little music history lesson. We really do. Because the history of Western music can be viewed in a really gross kind of way. And I know that music theorists and musicologists will probably have a conniption, but can be viewed as a gradual movement from line guy to chord guy over the length of the past 400 or 500 years. Because the original notated music that we have after Gregorian chant is pure line. It's just unharmonized melody. That's a pure line. Add another pure line to that unharmonized melody, and you have counterpoint. You have multiple lines going at the same time. And for the better part of several hundred years, from the 1200s up through the 1600s, the early 1600s, to Monteverdi and those people, music was counterpoint. It was line. It was multiple lines going, against each other. And that was what music was. And when you finally decided to add chords, importantly, to add chords as a major component of the musical texture, the chord part was stuffed into the continuo at the bottom of the music, where you had the harpsichordist or someone clanging along, playing chords. That's what they did. Those were the chords. But what mattered were the lines, the melodies, the tunes, obviously. But gradually, as time went on, that the hold of strict counterpoint, of that line-oriented mode of composition, was loosened. And it was loosened in numerous ways. It was loosened in the classical period by the classical style, which was based in the simple harmony and melody of comic opera, where you have really good tunes and really lovely harmonies and an orchestra that had to produce both. And so you had parts that were doing the chords and parts that were doing the lines, and they would interchange. The line could be in the bass, the chords could be on top, you could mix them and match them. And all of that tended to break down the primacy of that purely linear contrapuntal style. And in the Romantic period, that was even more the case, where it was all tune and accompaniment, and it was the harmony, the deep, rich, yummy, luscious, sexy, affecting harmony that gave us the music of Chopin, the music of Wagner, the music of the bel cantists in Italy, the opera folk, Donizetti and Bellini and these guys. It was chords that started to determine, let's put it that way, determine the lines in a way that had never really been the usual practice of composers. There was harmony becoming emancipated. The Tristan chord in Tristan and Isolde, it was just a harmony. I was like, just a chord. And it had its own identity, its own existence. And this conflict between chord and line, which is always at the heart of some really major works that we'll talk about in a minute. That was a very, very significant aesthetic revolution. And so then when you get into the 20th century, you start to get music which is entirely chord-based. Melody disappears, especially among avant-garde composers. And you wind up with things, for example, you wind up with the minimalists in the 1960s and 70s. These were composers for whom the chord was everything. There were no lines, even in works that claimed to have lines, like Vermont Counterpoint, for example, or pieces like that. They involved multiple lines, yes, but what mattered was the stability, the stasis of a few basic chords. The music was chord determined. And so that is music history over the past, 1,000 years or so in a nutshell. And so the composers who we're going to talk about all fit somewhere on this continuum. But despite the fact that they may have been working in styles which were more line-oriented or more chord-oriented, you still have the composer's own personality, the things that they cared about, whether they cared about color, whether they cared about texture, things that would have predisposed them to be more one thing or the other thing. And we're going to talk about that now as we go through the lists, because each composer has his own story, his own style, and that style is going to show a mix of chord versus line. Always both. There's always both in everything, really, unless you're writing a piece like in Schoenberg's 5 Pieces for Orchestra, Farben, where he was trying to simply dissolve the music into a series of shifting colors with no melody whatsoever, all chord-based. But even there, as long as one note succeeds another, you got line. You can't eliminate it entirely, because you're moving through time, and you're moving through time in a succession of notes, and that succession essentially creates a line, and it's very, very hard to get rid of it. I mean, composers try, some of them really do, but it's not an easy thing. Anyway, so let's go to the list, shall we? Chord Guys. First, Scarlatti. Yay! Oh, Scarlatti's so wonderful. 555 little keyboard sonatas, charming, and a couple fugues even that are quite contrapuntal. But what Scarlatti was, what makes his music so characterful and so fabulous, is a combination of harmony and keyboard virtuosity. And those are chord-oriented. It has to do with how many notes you can play, as fast as you can play them, and the amazing harmonies that you crash into as you're zipping through each one. I mean, even in his slow ones, I mean, the harmony is really telling. It's the harmony that creates the expression. And Scarlatti was a harmonist, even when his music is quite contrapuntal. So he was a chord guy. He was definitely a chord guy, because that's what you remember. That's what makes him distinctive. Lots of people could write, counterpoint, but could you write counterpoint that you remember the way Scarlatti does? You remember it because of the chords. After Scarlatti, Handel. Yes, Handel was a chord guy. Handel was a chord guy because Handel was a hedonist. Handel loved sexy, rich, succulent sounds. I mean, even in the Baroque period, even when you've got that continuo clonking along underneath, the orchestral texture generally, if you look at the scores to his operas, for example, you find such a variety of textures, even where he's only using strings. You could have strings doubled by oboes. You could have strings that are in 3 parts or in 2 parts or in just 1 part sometimes, or with the relationship between the voice and the accompaniment constantly changing for each aria. He was into sound. His Concerti Grossi Opus 6, gorgeous, gorgeous examples. The earliest really gorgeous examples of fabulous writing for strings, of creating this endless variety of texture and sound and mood and emotion with very, very beautiful harmonic underpinning. So Handel was also a chord guy, in spite of the contrapuntal basis for so much Baroque music. Another composer from the Baroque period who was definitely a chord guy was Vivaldi. Vivaldi is known, actually, because his music is so not contrapuntal. It's based on beautiful singing melodies with fresh sounding harmonies below them, and often very simple ones, repeated ones, almost minimalist sometimes. Vivaldi's music is often sneered at because it lacks the complexity that you hear in composers, for example, like Bach or people like that, as if everybody should write like Bach. I mean, wouldn't the world be an awfully boring place if that were true? Don't answer that question, Bachniks. We're not going there. But the point is that Vivaldi's 10 billion concerti, or even works like the Gloria, which I sang in in college glee club and whatnot, these are works that are extremely chordal. They're based on wonderfully sonorous chords, and he comes out of the school that gave us, Gabrielli and all those multi choral, brass ensemble things, which is also very, very chord based. So Vivaldi's music is definitely chordal, and that's what makes it popular. The simplicity of having a beautiful tune over a clear and harmonically affecting accompaniment. That's chord music. I mean, it really is, to a degree anyway. Very interesting next composer, C.P.E. Bach. C.P.E. Bach is fascinating because his dad was the ultimate line guy, and C.P.E. Bach was a chord guy. And you can hear it very, very clearly in his keyboard writing. C.P.E. Bach is not terribly interested in counterpoint. He is interested in harmony that's very emotionally affecting, and changing it with bewildering speed and going in very unpredictable places. You know, his emotional style, the Empfindungsstil, or whatever they called it in German, you know, was really a remarkable advance in musical language. And some people, again, they despise it because it wasn't contrapuntal. As contrapuntal is learned, and sophisticated, whereas just this chord stuff, it's just to express base emotions. Well, I mean, if it doesn't express base emotions, what the hell is the point, right? I mean, exactly. So C.P.E. Bach was a chord guy, and a wonderful one, and he described melody, which is, of course, a line, simply as the surface manifestation of an underlying scheme of harmony, of chords. And that was his style. And so it's fascinating to listen to father and son and hear the huge differences between them. It's amazing. I wonder if Bach sort of scratched his head and said to his first wife, it was Maria Barbara, I believe, was C.P.E.'s mother, not Anna Magdalena, and said, hey, honey, I'm a little worried about Junior. He seems like he's growing up to be a chord guy. Oh, my God, what are we going to do? Well, that's the way it worked out. And then Mozart, as we've talked about in the previous talk on pianists too, Mozart was also a chord guy, somebody who was really interested in the sensuous quality of sound. Mozart, as he aged, as he got more mature, he was 35 when he died, but as he got older, became much more interested in counterpoint. As we hear, for example, the finale of the Jupiter Symphony or the Great C Minor Mass, which was incomplete. He was a master contrapuntist because he was Mozart. He was great at everything. He really was. But one of the things that makes Mozart is gorgeous melodies, which are lines over fabulously sensual accompaniments, which are the chords, especially his use of new instruments like clarinets, things that would soften the tone, that would create blend, his amazing handling of woodwind instruments in groups. All of those things point to a composer whose love of beautiful sound makes him a chord guy to a degree. It's all a question of balance. Chopin's a fascinating case, actually, because he could be both. He really could. I mean, his sonatas, those are line things, basically, but his preludes and some of the other pieces are chord things. The scherzos are line music. The ballades are chord music. It's very interesting. You could sort of divvy up Chopin and give it a shot. A lot of his dance pieces, the mazurkas and the waltzes and things, are the polonaises even, are chord pieces. Because dance music is basically rhythmic chords. I mean, that's what dance music is, with a tune on top. It's rather simple, but in the more sophisticated, large-scale forms, Chopin understood that he had to be more line-oriented, and he could be. He really could be. I mean, there's a wonderful microcosm of the distinction between chord and line, but Chopin, on the whole, I think, was a chord guy, and he's often best performed by artists who understand the need to project always that subtlety of harmony, the beauty of tone, who can inflect a melodic line and its underlying harmonic accompaniment to create the maximum expressivity, which is what they all try to do. So, I mean, there you go. Berlioz, oh my goodness, the great English musicologist Sir Donald Francis Tovey said that Berlioz achieved everything that it's possible to achieve for a composer who hated counterpoint. And you could tell Berlioz hated counterpoint because most of his counterpoint is parodistic. There's the Witches' Sabbath and the Symphonie Fantastique. Yeah, they do a fugue, but it's a grotesque fugue. And there's the fugue in the tavern scene, in The Damnation of Faust. Berlioz could write counterpoint, but he despised it and he mocked it as often as not when he wrote it. Berlioz was one of the great orchestrators that ever lived. The orchestra was his instrument, and the way he used it was to create unbelievable sonorities, brilliant, amazing sounds that had never been heard before. And he was, without question, a chord guy, and alarming and exciting harmony on, to boot, and just scored with incredible brilliance. That's Berlioz. Debussy, the ultimate chord guy. He really is. I mean, he's one of the great chordists in the history of the universe. Now, he can be played in a way, and very effectively too, that realizes some of his music's linearity. Because, as I said, there's no such thing as pure one or the other. There isn't. And as soon as you've got notes flowing forward in time, you have lines. But Debussy wanted the piano to be an instrument without hammers. He is totally obsessed with masses of harmony and the changes in texture. And it's, oh gosh, the music is so wonderful, but both his piano music and his orchestral music. You don't find counterpoint very frequently in Debussy. Again, he's a composer whose style changed somewhat radically toward the end of his life. And you begin to hear more of that in the late sonatas and abstract pieces he wrote for various instruments and the etudes and whatnot. That becomes much, much more linear. But at its essence, Debussy was a chord guy. I mean, the Afternoon of a Faun, with that flute solo over dreamy arpeggios floating along. I mean, it's all chords. Chords, chords, chords. Scriabin was another chord guy. Scriabin, of course, was a theosophist, whatever that means. It's one of those weird spiritual things. And he had mystical chords, lots of mystical chords. And all of his music is really chord-based, especially the late sonatas, and the chords become quite dense and strange and chromatic and all of that stuff. But Scriabin is another really telling and interesting chordal composer. In fact, he's so much so that he's often misunderstood. I really believe that, what he did and the way he operated, he's become a marginalized figure because his emphasis on the chordal nature of music was so extreme that in some respects it became very difficult to follow. People heard it and were like, oh, that's weird. I mean, I think he knew what he was doing personally, but it was unquestionably chord guy style music. And then Messiaen. Last but not least, Messiaen was self-described as a chord guy. He was a harmonist and a rhythmician, whatever you call it, a rhythmicist. He was interested in Hindu rhythms, bird song, interesting harmony, and Jesus. That was Messiaen. And his style was based on a very rigidly structured series of harmonic modes. You call them modes of limited transposition sometimes. And he wrote pieces that were based on color, because he had synesthesia. He heard chords and he saw colors. So he wrote this is taupe and that was mauve and this prelude is cerise, and, whatever they call it in French. And, chartreuse. His music is full of color. Color means chords. Chromatic chords, chromo things, and he did chromo things all the time. But Messiaen will tell you when you're listening to his music, if you look at his notes, that these chords are this color, and then those chords are that color. And he was a chord guy, big time chord guy. So now we move to the line guys. Well, you know who the line guys are. Well, first of all, like I said, you have the entire Middle Ages and Renaissance to deal with your line guys. Because it's all lines. That's what that music is. It's mostly lines. There are some pieces that tend to get chordal because they're just so complicated, like Thomas Tallis's famous motet Spem in Allium for 5 or 8 5-part choirs, the 40-part motet. That just sounds like piles of chords because, after all, you've got so many things happening at the same time, they all kind of congeal. But the essence of it was all linear. And so we don't really see the contrast between chord guys and line guys breaking out until we get to the Baroque period. And Bach. Bach is the ultimate line guy. Everything he did was counterpoint, and amazing counterpoint, and fabulous, astonishing counterpoint. For me, the quintessential Bach works, if you're getting into Bach, are the organ trios, because they are 3 perfectly pure lines of music. 2 hands and your feet. 3 parts going all the time, playing off of each other, pure line music and wonderful line music. And of course, those lines, as they jostle off of one another, create chords. And those chords create harmony, and that harmony is extraordinarily emotionally affecting and beautiful, but it arises out of the music's linearity. And that's Bach. Bach in a nutshell. After Bach, Zelenka. Zelenka is, one of those Baroque composers who's just coming into his own, actually, in the past few decades. He was a genius, a master of he wrote almost entirely sacred music, and a very small but precious group of instrumental works, a bunch of trio sonatas and capriccios, some orchestral pieces and things like that. But mostly what he wrote was sacred music, mass settings for the most part. And he was a genius at counterpoint. I mean, Bach admired him tremendously. Anyone who liked counterpoint admired Zelenka because he was able to create fugues based on really interesting musical subjects. Sometimes they're just one note. Sometimes they could sound like Czech folk songs. He was phenomenal in his ability to create wonderful contrapuntal linear combinations of melodies that were very distinctive. That didn't sound like any other composer. I mean, because, counterpoint has very strict rules. In order, if you're going to make tonal counterpoint, there are things you need to do in order to keep it from sounding just like a god-awful mess. And a lot of the things that allow you to follow the rules, to create clean counterpoint, involve using thematic material that is not in and of itself very interesting. It's the structure that you're building that's more interesting than the individual components. But Zelenka's individual components were really weird and really cool. Strange, syncopated melodies. He showed how counterpoint didn't preclude tons of character. And for that reason, he's a very, very special composer and a marvelous example of a line guy. After Zelenka, Haydn. The opposite of Mozart. It's fascinating. They were friends. They were very different composers. And Haydn was definitely a line guy. He grew up with the great contrapuntal treatise, Gradus ad Parnassum, by Fuchs, F-U-X was his name. I mean, that was the counterpoint treatise. And he taught himself from that treatise. He studied it very, very hard. He was one of the great contrapuntists. Haydn could do amazing fugues. And it was Haydn who reintroduced counterpoint into the language of early classical music and created the great classical style, the style that Mozart and Beethoven took over, because he was able to show how it was possible to use counterpoint in a basically chordal setting. And you find these things first and foremost in the Opus 20 string quartets, 3 of which end with actual fugues. Pure counterpoint, pure line in the string quartet context. And after that, he integrated these contrapuntal elements into his music, and in the most marvelous way. I mean, it's phenomenal. And his late choral works, the Masses and the Creation and the Seasons, they have some of the most stunning examples of fugal writing in the entire repertoire, of beautiful, affecting counterpoint that serves the heart as well as the head. As does Bach, as does all the great contrapuntists, yes, but Haydn was definitely one of them. Then we come to Beethoven. Beethoven was, in a way, at the fulcrum. He was a chord guy and a line guy. He always struggled with counterpoint. Beethoven, as a composer, tends to represent struggle, striving, and his work with contrapuntal elements is often full of tortured, angular, difficult music. It's really kind of fascinating, especially later in his career. The finale of the Hammerklavier Sonata, for example, or the Grosse Fuge for string quartet. These are the great fugues in the Missa Solemnis. Beethoven was trying to reconcile the chordal style and the contrapuntal style, the dramatic style of opera and theatrical music, which was basically chordal music, and the rhetorical style, structure and grandeur of the linear style. But what matters most about Beethoven, the influence he had on later music, was not the chordal style. It was the linear aspect. It was the fact that he was ultimately, I think, in terms of his own predilections, and once he achieved this sort of integration of the two elements, or juxtaposition of the two elements, he was a line guy. And the best performances of Beethoven, I think, reflect that because his music is moving forward always in time. It doesn't even when it's very cosmic, as in the slow movement of the Hammerklavier, for example, where he's really juxtaposing stasis with movement. We appreciate the stasis because it's surrounded by movement. It's the movement that ultimately is going to triumph. And so Beethoven, I think, wound up being sort of a line guy. Another line guy was Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn's early education was based in Berlin, was based on study of Bach. That's where he got his start. And his Bach orientation is extremely important and extremely prominent. And he was also a very gifted and natural contrapuntist. And you hear it wonderfully in his chamber music, in the octet, where you have 8 strings that never congeal into merely, one group of 4 and another group of 4. I mean, it's a genuine blending all the time with every conceivable combination of parts going all over the place. It's really amazing. And he was only 18 when he wrote it, or thereabouts. Really astonishing. His string quartets are miracles of beautiful linear counterpoint in very harmonically rich and emotionally powerful settings. His last quartet, which is absolutely terrifying in its passion and its despair. Really, really fantastic stuff. He's very underrated still as a composer. And probably because he was more of a line guy than a chord guy. And he was living in the beginning of the Romantic period. And most of the Romantic composers were chord guys, not line guys, because chord guys are more emotional, or they tend to be more emotional. And Mendelssohn was always extremely polished and cultivated. But so he was a line guy. Sue him. What the hell? It's amazing. Dvořák. Dvořák was another line guy. He started out as a chord guy, by the way, and very, very quickly evolved into a line guy, which so impressed his friend Brahms. And the two of them may as well be considered together because they are the two great line guy symphonists of the second half of the 19th century, more or less, or two of the greatest line guy symphonists. They were symphonists in the classical sense, in the Beethovenian tradition of drama and struggle and all of that stuff expressed in a linear narrative that carries the music forward irresistibly from beginning to end. They did it in different ways. Brahms was much more self-consciously contrapuntal than Dvořák was. But Dvořák was no mean line guy. I mean, he was good at that stuff. If you listen to the symphonic variations and the fugue at the end, or the Quam Olim Abrahe fugue and his Requiem, he was a joyful line guy when he had a chance to write counterpoint. And he was a master at variation and combining melodies in all kinds of different ways within a very colorful framework. I mean, Dvořák's orchestration is much more colorful than Brahms's. Brahms's emphasizes more the linearity. Dvořák, maybe the coloristic aspects of his essentially linear style, but they were both line guys. When you're a symphonist, you kind of have to be, because if you're writing works in large forms where you have to be able to carry on, create large architectural musical shapes over long periods of time, you need to have the line-oriented chops to do it. You're not going to get there with just a series of attractive chords. You're not, however beautiful your harmony is. And Dvořák's harmony was gorgeous. His melodies were astonishing, but he still had to have that wonderful, wonderful architectural strength, as Brahms did, of course. And Bruckner, well, Bruckner was definitely a line guy. We all know that, don't we? I mean, there's the gigantic fugue in the finale of the Fifth Symphony, and combinations of melodies. They're played right side up and upside down simultaneously and slightly canonically, a few bars apart from each other. And I mean, we don't need to go into it in ridiculous detail. Bruckner was an organist. Organ music, church music, the German style is very, very contrapuntal, based as it is on the style of the great German Baroque composers like Bach and Buxtehude and Pachelbel and all those people. And Bruckner was a composer in that style, without a doubt. Excuse the little bell dingy thing going off. After Bruckner, Mahler. Now, Mahler was famous for saying there is only counterpoint. He said, there is no harmony, only counterpoint. That was Mahler's motto. He spent a lot of time studying his Bach. His music is amazingly contrapuntal. And a lot of the genius of Mahler, who was probably the greatest symphonic orchestrator that ever lived, is the way that he writes for instruments in a way so as to create the maximum of textural clarity at all points. And that clarity is used to build enormous symphonic structures that have tremendous emotional weight and impetus at all times. But Mahler was an amazing contrapuntal writer as well, and definitely a line guy. And last but not least, we're going to conclude with another very interesting line guy, Vaughan Williams. And Vaughan Williams is interesting to me because his linearity arises out of his study of earlier music, of Renaissance music, of modal music. In other words, it's the harmony that creates the line, because he uses this beautiful modal harmony with intertwining lines. And in the Tallis Fantasia, the music for the string quartet, or his whole Third Symphony, which is a series of layers of harmony on different planes that form their own kind of it's a natural, beautiful, flowing counterpoint that sounds both modern and ancient at the same time. And it's really, really extraordinary. But again, when you talk about symphonists generally, you're going to be talking about line guys, because that's the nature of that style. It really is. So there you have it, my friends. Chord guys and line guys, 10 of each. And the people who play them most effectively will probably partake of the same emphases of chords versus lines. But like I keep saying, everybody has both. Great music has both. It all has both. It's a question of proportion. It's all about proportion, and how you listen. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.